When Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, was first released in May 1950, it was pretty broadly panned in scientific circles. One of the reasons for this was its lack of scientific credibility. Since Hubbard had pretty much dreamed it up using hypnotic techniques and had failed to provide any evidence of rigorous scientific testing, it could hardly be labeled a science at all. That didn't stop the book from becoming a national bestseller, and the Dianetics therapeutic technique from becoming very popular for about a year or so. Then people tended to find out for themselves that it didn't really do anything like what Hubbard promised, and there were very few people being cured of cancer, leukemia, bad eyesight, and a host of other illnesses which Hubbard claimed were psychosomatic in nature. Its popularity waned, and Hubbard eventually went bankrupt. He then decided the scientific approach was not really working out so well, and he started a new religion instead, using the same pseudoscientific therapy techniques, and called it Scientology. However, almost from day one, Hubbard tried to gain scientific credibility after the fact of publishing his work using psychological and personality testing of Dianetics patients. Various standardized tests were used, including the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the California Test of Mental Maturity for Adults, the Brunreiter Personality Inventory, and the Otis Tests of Mental Ability. A booklet was published by the Hubbard Dianetics Research Foundation in January 1951 to show positive changes in these test scores as a result of Dianetic processing. The authors took great pains to state that they had not run rigidly controlled experiments to test Dianetics results, which of course would be something any science worth its name would actually do to present validation of its results. Also, they complain about the validity of the tests used, since they claim that Dianetics has no parallel in the history of psychology. Psychologists had been trying for decades before Dianetics came along to resolve the problem of psychosomatic trauma and illnesses. To state that Dianetics was something without parallel in the field of mental health was meaningless hyperbole, and I believe was just meant to give Hubbard an excuse to not follow through with rigorous scientific testing. Of course, that's exactly what happened. After failing to get the scientific validation he craved, and with Dianetics bankrupt and the copyrights to the work lost, Hubbard gave up on trying to use standardized psychological tests to gain scientific support for his claims. In fact, it appears he wanted to move away from using them at all. However, he still liked the idea of selling people on his techniques by claiming they were scientific in nature. It sounds very impressive and gives Scientology a credibility it never earned and doesn't deserve. So, Hubbard developed Scientology's own tests. Now, Hubbard did not actually sit down and write the first personality test himself. Instead, he had a Scientologist staff member named Julia Salmon Lewis write it, and she copyrighted it in 1955. Ray Kemp later wrote a column claiming that in 1956, back when Ray himself was still a Scientologist, Ron had spoken with him about the APA and wasn't happy about it. Ray had studied some psychology and suggested that one reason for the poor results was that American personalities were not the same as British, German, French, or other cultures' personalities. Ron asked him to write a test that was more general in nature, but would maintain the same format as the APA. Ray went to work on this, and a few months later, the result was the Oxford Capacity Analysis. He said it's not a personality test as such, but tests the capacity of any person with respect to various traits and syndromes. For example, a person with no action level, but who is very depressed, is not likely to commit suicide. But a very depressed person who also shows a high action level and a high tendency to spur-of-the-moment activity is much more a suicide risk. According to Ray, the graph is not the person's personality, but is a picture of how the person thinks others view him and what he agrees with. Ray was not a trained psychologist and, as far as I could find, had no formal training in clinical testing, so I take everything he says about his test results with a grain of salt. These APA-OCA tests were only used internally in Scientology up until 1960 to see how auditing was working on people. Ray claimed that in 1959, the test was revised with certain questions that a person who had achieved the state of clear would answer differently, and he made the scoring system easier to administer. Ray said he copyrighted the test in 1960, but, as with so many other things in Scientology, the credit was given to Hubbard and was later copyrighted and trademarked in Hubbard's name.